Good evening, everyone. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Billy Guerrero, and I'm an outreach and collections assistant of the Alf Museum. And on behalf of the Alf Museum, allow me to welcome you all to another installment of our online speaker series for the web community, Moments of Time. In this series, we celebrate our founder, Dr. Raymond Alf, known for asking the question, what will you do with your moment of time? Now, he knew what he wanted to do. Ray was a scientist, a teacher, a renowned storyteller. He started a wonderful tradition of science storytelling at our museum. Today, we carry on that tradition in our many unique and innovative educational programs as part of our mission to continue to provide accessible education to everyone within our community. And now we get to add our Moment of Time speaker series for all of you in our web community. In this series, we hope to share amazing science stories as told by our staff, students, and other scientists within our museum community, a way for us to share our moments of time. Now, first up, we have some words from Laura Wensley over at the Web Schools.
Hi, everybody. We have some exciting news. The museum life trustee, Doug Miles, and his wife, Ann, have just announced a $15,000 challenge gift for the upcoming Peccary Society dinner. All ticket purchases, dinner sponsorships, and gifts to the museum made before midnight on October 16th will be matched dollar for dollar by Doug and Ann Miles. So please visit our website. I'm going to put the link in our chat. And to register to attend the virtual 28th Annual Peccary Society dinner, and please support the Alf Museum. A gift of any size will help us with our challenge. Also, I've included in the chat a link to our previous Moments of Time. They're recorded and on our website, and we hope you'll enjoy tonight as well as previous Moments of Time.
So thanks, Laura, and we hope to see you all at this year's virtual Peccary dinner. Now, on with the show. Allow me to introduce tonight's speaker, Gabriel Santos, Collections Manager and Outreach Coordinator of the Alf Museum. Gabe earned his BS from UC Irvine, majoring in biology, and his master's degree from CSU Fullerton, majoring in geology and earth science. He previously studied the evolution of marine mammals in Southern California and now focuses on science education as the co-founder of the Cosplay for Science initiative and a National Geographic certified educator. So please welcome Gabriel Santos.
Thanks, Billy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Moments of Time. As Billy said, I know things are a little bit different today because normally I'm on Billy's side of things, but today I actually will be presenting a little bit on my work and research that I've done in the past and kind of how I work now at the museum as an educator. And really quick reminder, we will be doing a Q&A at the end of my presentation. Just make sure you use the Q&A box, and that can be found right down at the bottom of your screen. So just click on that little Q&A box and you'll be able to ask all your questions. So let me see if I can get my screen share started. Ah, there we go. Okay, so today this is what I'm going to be talking about. Teaching paleontology, from Desmostylians to Tauntauns. Two very weird words that probably you've never seen next to each other. So really quick, just to start off about who I am, for those of you who may not know me very well. I am a paleontologist and educator at the Alf Museum. I am a first-generation Filipino-American scientist born and raised in Los Angeles, technically Orange County, but if you're not from LA, you really don't care probably. I got my BS in biological sciences at UC Irvine, majoring in pre-med, and then I kind of changed my mind after I graduated. And eventually I wound up getting a master's in paleontology at Cal State Fullerton. Now, while I was at Cal State Fullerton, I actually applied for a job at a small museum up on a hill called the Alf Museum. Not really thinking I'd get the job, but it was just something that I thought would be really cool for me to work at. It kind of seemed like my dream job, being able to work on a high school campus, to teach kids and, you know, be able to do really cool stuff at a museum. And I got the job. So that's how I became the collections manager at the Alf Museum. And I'm also now the outreach coordinator there, helping to develop our education and outreach programs. Currently, I'm also a AAAS science superhero. That's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where I get to help talk about the benefits of science to students across the country. I am a National Geographic certified educator, which means I basically took a course on how to teach using the National Geographic methods. And in my spare time, which I guess kind of counts in my normal time now, I'm a, quote, semi-professional cosplayer. And I'll get a little bit into why I say semi-professional. But one of the things that links all of these things together is that my passion really lies in storytelling. So storytelling, how does that work with science? Well, for me, one of my most favorite quotes is that storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. Whether we're talking about science, we're talking about art, anything, storytelling is the best way to get people interested in it. And, you know, our whole culture is based around stories, no matter what we do, whether we're talking to our friends, our family, as teachers, even strangers talking to one another. At the core of everything we do is storytelling. Our whole language is based around being able to exchange and convey information. And as a scientist, that's what we do. Scientists are basically storytellers. And as a paleontologist, all of our stories come from the ancient world. You know, the ancient world is such a mystery to us. It's something that we've never seen, something that we'll never actually be able to really know, like with our own eyes. And so as paleontologists, the questions we have about what this world was like, and it inspires our research. And as scientists, our research becomes our stories. But for those wondering, like, how does a scientific paper kind of turn into a story? Well, let's take a second and look at narrative structure. So if you're looking at a narrative structure, if anybody's read a book, watched a movie, it all kind of has the same kind of arc to it, right? You set the scene, you have the problem that the protagonist has to solve, you have going all the way up to the climax, and then the closing action and the resolution, the nice happy ending for most movies. But if you take this structure and apply it to science or a scientific paper, it follows pretty much the same arc, right? In a scientific paper, you've got your introduction, introducing the history. Then you've got your methods and materials to address your hypothesis. And then you get to your description explaining what happened. And from there, you discuss everything, and then you get your conclusion. So here you can see kind of how science and storytelling are very, very closely linked to each other. And like I said, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world, just like science. And for a lot of people, you know, we think of science storytelling as something that's kind of new, right? But in reality, if we look all the way back to some of our ancient myths and legends, really what they were was the first explanations of science. These were very, very, very early scientific papers, basically. They were having to describe the world around them with very little evidence and this very little knowledge that we have today. They were the first people to do these kind of things. One of my favorite examples is this right here. These are fossil sea urchins, but in ancient Europe, these were called thunderstones. So people in ancient Europe would find these stones, as they call them, at the edge of cliffs and beaches after thunderstorms. And so what they believed was that these were the ends of thunderbolts. You know, they believed that the great thunder god would throw them from the sky and they'd end up on the beach. And when they went out after a storm, they would find them and collect them. And then the belief was if they placed a thunderstone in their homes, thunder or lightning would never strike their house, because the old saying goes, lightning never strikes twice. But what they were really doing was explaining erosion. After large thunderstorms and all the rain and wind hitting cliffs and sandstone, they would erode all those rocks out, and these sea urchin fossils would fall on the beach. And so their ancient story of finding thunderstones is actually their very first explanation of erosion of fossils and deposition, technically, too. And so this thing that we're doing, when we you know, these ancient people would describe myths and legends to describe the world around them. That inspired me so much. And it really affected the way that I like to do science today. And that really shows in my very first scientific paper that I got to do was with these creatures here, Desmostylians, the hippo-shaped elephant-sized rhino relatives. Now, for a lot of people, when I say this word, Desmostylians, they go, Desmo what? They've probably never heard of these creatures before, or let alone seen them in any museum. But Desmostylians are super cool, and some of my favorite prehistoric animals, or actually just some of my favorite animals out there. Like I said, they're these hippo-like rhino relatives, right? But it's still hard to imagine still. So why don't we do a little imagination time? Close your eyes, put yourself on a beautiful beach in the Pacific Northwest, the beautiful conifers, the cold weather, which I am missing because it's still hot here in October. And coming down the beach, you hear this kind of crashing, you know, down the beach. And you look up and you see these huge animals, something about the size of an elephant, but its body is shaped somewhat like a hippopotamus. It's got that rotund, round body, very long columnar legs, and its head looks like a hippo. But take that head and pull it out and stretch it a little bit. That is a Desmostylian. So is this what you had in mind? It's probably hard because this is just a fossil skeleton of a Desmostylian. So it's maybe what you got, maybe not. But if we slap some skin on it, maybe this will clear up the picture of what Desmostylians are a little bit more. Like I said, they're these hippo-shaped, elephant-sized rhino relatives. And a quick shout out to my brother, Justin, who drew this illustration for me that got to be part of my publication. It really is helpful when you have an artist in the family who will do all your publication illustrations for cheap or free, depending on what kind of mood I'm in. Sorry, Jess. But yeah, so Desmostylians were these huge, really weird marine mammals. Here's a skull of one. This skull is about the same size as an elephant skull. And there's nothing like them today. They're so mysterious. We have all of these fossils of them, and we know very, very little about them. There are very few researchers who have actually looked at Desmostylians in detail. And like I said, they have this very similar shape to hippopotamus, right? Here is a hippo skull, and here is a Desmostylian skull. Two very similar looking animals, but they're not related. Like I said, they are related to rhinos. So if we go forward. Oh, so Desmostylians are these weird animals, and they're known very much for their teeth. Desmostylians have these teeth that kind of look like a bunch of sushi rolls all put together, like I call it, as you can see in the presentation. And they are found all over the northern Pacific coast. And we have tons of these teeth all throughout different fossil collections, just so many. In the previous museum I worked at, we had probably tens of teeth just in the drawers, just waiting to be looked at. And they're found all along the North Pacific coast because there are these semi-aquatic coastal herbivores that ate aquatic plants and algae. And they lived for about 25 million years in the North Pacific coasts. And like I said, these were my very first foray into paleontology. And the reason that they were is because at the Cooper Center where I used to work, they had this weird fossil there. This is OCPC 22650. It is the jaw of a very old toothless Desmostylian. So remember how I said Desmostylians are known for their many, many teeth found throughout different museums? How is something a Desmostylian when they have absolutely no teeth whatsoever, when it's missing its signature component? Well, that question led me to wanting to figure out the story as to what makes this a Desmostylian. This became the character in my very first story, which was actually my very first scientific publication. So what happened was OCPC 22650 is just this really old Desmostylian. And what we were hypothesizing was that these Desmostylians were starting to wear down their teeth all throughout their life until they lost it completely. And it was able to survive into an old age. And so this gave us this really great picture of what Desmostylians were doing. And so what I did is to really complete the story was look at other Desmostylians all throughout California, and also look at previous publications from Japan and Russia. And we were able to figure out and put together the story of how Desmostylians go from having all these really weird, amazing teeth to no teeth at all. And that's how we came up with these Desmostylian life stages. As babies, Desmostylians have tiny little milk teeth, and they were able to survive in really, fresh water where they can eat really soft aquatic plants. And as they got older and bigger, their teeth got bigger as well. And this allowed them to move out into seagrass beds. And in the seagrass beds, seagrass grows in very siliceous environment, which means it's very, very sandy. And if anything tries to eat seagrass, they're going to get a lot of sand in their mouth. And if you've ever been a kid and for some reason you're playing on the playground and you get sand in your teeth, if you've been to the beach and you open your mouth because you're just enjoying it, like, wow, look at that sunset, and wind blows and sand gets in your mouth, you bit down and you felt that gritty, hard silica on your teeth. And over time for Desmostylians, those tiny little sand grains would just wear down their teeth all the way to nothing. Now, in most animals, the story ends there. Once you don't have teeth, there's no way for you to eat. In modern elephants, they will wear down their teeth to nothing, and then they unfortunately will starve to death. But Desmostylians, some of these specimens, especially OCPC 22650, it survived losing all of its teeth. Its jaw was remodeled. The little tooth sockets, or alveoli as we called them, were filled in again. They had closed up. And so that meant that its story didn't end there. Something allowed it to continue to another chapter in its life. And so what we figured out was that Desmostylus, which is what this animal was, once they got so big, they can go out into very deep water where kelp forests were. And they were able to munch and gnaw on these very, very soft kelp. And our hypothesis was supported because at the same time, there was another group of marine mammals, the dugongs. Some of them were starting to lose their teeth, and another group had lost their teeth completely because they were feeding on kelp. And so there's an example of other marine mammals feeding on kelp without the need of teeth. And so that really supported our hypothesis of Desmostylians in the last chapter of their life going out into the kelp forest and munching. And because they were so big, like elephants, other predators didn't want to mess with them, except for maybe Megalodon, but that's a story that I have not yet finished. So we'll get to that another time. But like I said, this was my very first foray into scientific research, my very first publication, my very first science story. And I learned a lot about the importance of science and science storytelling and getting people to understand what the ancient world was like. I learned a lot about the responsibility of scientists and also as educators in ensuring that people are able to really imagine and understand deep time and how things have changed over the millennia. And that really helped me once I started my master's program and I started my master's project. Oops. So yeah, OCPC 22650 was this really old, toothless, I assume grumpy, because if it was old and lost all of its teeth and just had to munch on seaweed, I'd probably be a little grumpy too. Desmostylian. But like I said, all of that helped me going into my master's thesis because my amazing, wonderful advisor, who I absolutely love, thought it was a great idea to let me do 2 projects in my master's. So the Desmostylian was one, and then I had my actual master's thesis. Now for my master's thesis, I was given the project of this thing called the TALEGA bone bed. Now a bone bed is this very, very dense concentration of lots of bones in one small area. There are these wonderful snapshots of time that let you learn a lot about what an area was like compared to just having a single fossil. So that's what the TALEGA bone bed was. I was tasked with figuring out how it got there and what was inside. Basically trying to figure out the cast of characters and what they went through to end up here as the TALEGA bone bed. So the TALEGA bone bed was found in 1998 in a housing project down in San Clemente by San Diego. They were digging out like the foundation. I don't know. I'm not into building and stuff in construction, so I'm just gonna stop talking about that. Basically, they found these really big fossils, this huge bone bed where they were gonna put a bunch of houses. And then what happened was they found all this bone bed and they're like, we need to save these. These are the first fossils of these kind found in this area, right? And so what happened was the construction company was like, no, we're not stopping. We need to build these houses. And so to ensure that they were able to preserve all these wonderful fossils really fast, what they did was they put them in these 46 1-ton square meter jackets. When my advisor told me that this was my master's thesis, I kind of had a panic attack. Like, there's no way I'm going to work on 46. Sure, 3 had been done already, but that left 43. But my advisor just kind of laughed at me and said, no, you only need to work on 5. So that's what I did. I took these jackets, we worked on them with some of my interns and other students at Cal State Fullerton, and we started to remove as much matrix to find all the wonderful fossils inside and really start to get a picture of what was happening, how these fossils got there, who these characters were, and what they went through to get to being the bone bed. So again, we took a jacket and we had to look what was inside. So here we go. We opened up a jacket and we found out a lot of really cool things by opening up these jackets. We found out that there were 3 distinct layers, right? And if you're into geology, or if you've heard some of our museum tours, the layers of geology are like stories of a book, right? Each layer on top of another one is a brand new chapter in the history of Earth. So luckily for me, I had 3 wonderful chapters in my story of this TALEGA bone bed. At the very bottom, which is the very earliest chapter of the TALEGA bone bed, there are this non-fossiliferous layer, no bones whatsoever. And then all of a sudden on top, you have tons and tons of bones all stacked up and bunched up together. And right on top of that, you have another layer with some bones, but not as many. And the sand kind of changes and gets finer as you go upward through time. And if we looked at all the different bones in the main bone bed layer, like I said, there were just tons and tons all piled up on top of each other. Some were really, really beautifully preserved, and some were just broken up and we'll never be able to identify them. I know I didn't, because I didn't really feel like wasting my time. But there were some really great fossils in it that I was able to identify. And looking at the fossils, we were able to find 24 different types of animals that existed at the same time in the TALEGA bone bed here in California about 45 million years ago. And like I said, my task was trying to figure out who these casts of characters were and what they were doing, what the setting was, and how they got there. By looking at these animals and looking at the geology, I was able to figure out that this group of Eocene mammals were pretty typical cast of characters for what was happening in the Eocene. But we were also able to figure out that they were living in an open canopy rainforest with a lot of water. As these animals died over hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, all their bodies decomposed and ended up and washed up in this river. And as they went down the river, they ended up in this one big pile, which eventually became the TALEGA bone bed. And so that was my second foray into scientific research. And I learned a lot about how to do science and, again, science storytelling. But going through all of this, I also learned that, through this, I also learned that, it takes a lot to teach people about paleontology. I started to do a lot of talks about my master's thesis. I started to create like miniature exhibits that I got to take places. I went to schools and afternoon activity fairs and things like that to talk about the TALEGA bone bed. And doing all of that, I really, really started to realize that my passions really lied in talking about the past, teaching people about the past and teaching them about these stories. Like I said, I've said a lot of times in Moments of Time is that every fossil is worth 1,000 stories. And I wanted to be the one to be able to tell as many of them as I could. And so after doing my master's thesis and also working at the Alf Museum, I really, really started to get more into education. And again, my favorite quote is, storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. And I took that to heart when I got into the museum and started doing more education. We started to go out and do many more activities to get kids to engage with scientists and learn about the natural world directly from paleontologists. Here's me at 2 museum events, at National Fossil Day and the STEM Fair here in Pomona. I started to look more into how storytelling can be more inclusive for those who may have disabilities, people who are hard of hearing, people who are blind, people on the autistic spectrum. There are many ways that we can look at storytelling and education to make sure it's as inclusive as possible so that everyone can enjoy stories on the same level. I even got an amazing chance while working at the Alf Museum to go to Mongolia as a collaborative project with the Institute for the Study of Mongolian Dinosaurs to talk about paleontology with these kids in Mongolia out in the Gobi Desert. What we did is we got to travel on the movable museum and go out to remote places and villages in the Gobi Desert where their nearest museum is more than a day's drive and on very bumpy roads in some cases. And imagine driving this bus through the desert. It was fun, but scary sometimes. We even rode through a sandstorm, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, while I was here, you know, I really got to work with a lot of these kids, but most of these kids don't speak English. And there's a problem with that because in the movable museum, all the exhibits are in English. So how do you get a bunch of kids to learn about paleontology in their own language when everything they have is in English? And that's why I got to go there, is develop augmented reality program where we can overlay Mongolian Cyrillic translations over the existing English ones to help these students to understand and learn the story about their own natural history in their own language, make it accessible to them instead of having to have a translator on the bus at all times. And this, like I said, is where I really learned to love my passion for storytelling and making sure it's available to everybody. Here's me with Billy and our Mongolian exchange students from last summer. Really great kids who I got to meet again when I went back to Mongolia. And doing all of that together really solidified how I want my career to go from now on as an educational storyteller. It's not about creating original stories. It's about using what's there and making connections for people to connect to the science in their everyday lives, whether it's natural history, physics, anything like that. I really love to use existing narratives and connecting it to things that we love, whether it's a cultural narrative, ecological, or even contemporary narratives. The world is just full of them and full of different ways to help people connect to the science in their lives. I mean, even the role of narrative in science communication. There are tons of papers all about it nowadays, talking about how we need to use narrative structure to communicate science better. And as most of us know, nowadays, there's a very anti-science sentiment out there and a distrust of science. So we need more of this so that we can ensure that we can start to change those attitudes. So in cultural narratives, it's things like I said with the thunderstones, or like here, you have Cyclops. This is the skull of a mammoth, and in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they found these skulls, but they thought they were giant humans with a single eye where the trunk should be. And so you're able to connect those stories that people know about, the Cyclops and giants, and connect it to science by talking about how they thought they were mammoths and mastodons. In ecological narratives, for centuries, indigenous peoples have told stories about the natural world around them as a way to convey information through generations. And for a long time, these stories were just considered stories. But now, as people are, you know, more involved in indigenous communities and getting them involved in science, these stories are being realized that these are the very first scientific narratives for a lot of indigenous cultures. My favorite example is of the firehawks in Australia. The Aborigines in Australia used to tell the story of these hawks that would use fire to draw out prey from the grasslands. And when the European scientists arrived, they're like, no, that doesn't make sense. They never saw it. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago that they saw this happening in real life. They saw hawks actually picking up fire on sticks from like lightning strikes or something like that and dropping it into grasslands so they could draw out prey and capture them. So here's a wonderful example of how we can incorporate indigenous traditional stories that are actual science-based stories and use them to communicate them to audiences worldwide and connect, again, culture and science for so many people. Here's an example that I did. This is from my Instagram a few years ago. Some of you might have heard of the discovery of a new species of human in the Philippines. So I started to do some research because I'm Filipino, like I said, and I've heard stories of these Philippine myths for as long as I can remember. And one of them was of these tiny little creatures that lived in caves and holes. And one of the things was that when you saw them, you're supposed to bow, right? Because you have to like not disrespect these monsters or they'll take you in the caves. And then when they discovered these fossils of tiny humans in caves, it kind of made a connection for me. So perhaps some ancient Filipinos were going into these caves and finding these skeletons of tiny humanoids. And their original explanation was these were tiny monsters that lived in caves, and they kind of created a whole story around them. And now we have an explanation for our stories of these tiny humans in a scientific way of thinking about them. And of course, contemporary. Anything we think about today, there are connections to science everywhere, especially in popular culture. As paleontologists, we are so lucky because we have Jurassic Park, and any kid who loves dinosaurs that comes into a museum has probably seen Jurassic Park at least once and will tell you all about the T-Rex or Velociraptor, and it becomes a great way to talk to a person and teach them about the science. Because, you know, Jurassic Park is not scientifically accurate. It's a great movie, bad science, but when we are able to connect the science to it and tell them how things are supposed to be, it's a great meeting place between people who, you know, may think that science is not for them, or who may be afraid of talking to a paleontologist, or, you know, are just afraid of sounding dumb and asking a question. Once we bring things to their level of, or not even their level, once we're on the same level of that talking about pop culture, it becomes easier to exchange information. And I do this all the time. This is actually my current project. I am the co-founder of this project called Cosplay for Science, where we combine paleontology, or science now, education, and pop culture by cosplaying, which is basically putting on a costume of a pop culture character and connecting it to science stories. You know, we are paleontologists and scientists from throughout the United States, and we go to comic book conventions and community events and talk all about the way that folks can find science in their everyday lives and interests, whether we're talking about Jurassic Park. Here I am dressed up as Dr. Ellie Sattler, and I was really rocking those shorts. I'm just saying. The goals of the initiative: we want to foster interest in science by making it relatable by pop culture themes and narrative structure. We want to develop trust in scientists by using cosplay because it makes us approachable. We're no longer a scientist to them. We are a cosplayer, and then they find out we're scientists, so that barrier is already broken and they just want to talk to us. And we want to encourage other scientists to think about accessibility and relatability in science communication and education. Again, using narrative for folks to think about the world around them. Here I am at Disneyland dressed as a wilderness explorer from the movie Up, and I'm talking about the fake geology in one of the rides at Disneyland. It's a really fun way, and I got a lot of people to ask me questions about geology by doing this post. I talk about Star Wars all the time. If you don't know who I am, or this is your first time meeting me, I love Star Wars, like a lot. Like, here's paleontology and here's Star Wars. Like, that's how much I love Star Wars. And I love using Star Wars to connect science because inherently there's so much science that inspired the world of Star Wars. And of course, like I said, we go to pop-up museums, and that's where we do most of our work, in our pop-up museums. This is a lot of my research now in developing pop-up museums and understanding how folks learn through pop-up museums, and also learn and understand how much pop culture influences people's desire to learn as well. So with pop-up museums, we go to Comic-Cons and community events, and we interact in a place not traditionally known for science education, and get people to utilize critical thinking skills and get them to learn to ask the right kind of questions in fictional settings. We, like I said, we go to non-traditional settings, and we always make these pop-up museums based on different pop culture franchises like Game of Thrones, Jurassic Park, Pokemon. And we show the science behind science fiction. We combine all of the things I talked about, storytelling, immersion, pop culture, and education, all to get everybody to understand the world around them better. Oops. Here we are in our Pokemon Natural History Museum, probably one of my favorite ones because we got to use a lot of really cool Pokemon stuff that I have just lying in my house. We recently got to work with the Jim Henson Company to create a brand new pop-up museum for their brand new book called Frankenstein High. It's a school for future mad scientists. And so what we did is we developed classrooms for Frankenstein High, and we acted as the professors. This is our anatomy classroom on how to build your own minion. And it was such a fun event. We got to teach kids about anatomy and get them to learn how to ask questions about how do their bones connect, how do muscles work, and things like that. And it was probably one of my most favorite things I've ever done. We do panels at community events and Comic-Cons by bringing scientists from their labs or whatever, letting them dress up and interact with audiences who may never get a chance before to talk with a scientist. Here are some paleontologists in our panel talking about their research. And again, they're all cosplaying, they're breaking down barriers and having people learn to trust scientists and want to communicate with them. And again, this all comes back down to storytelling and sharing, right? Here's our Star Wars Galactic Archive, my personal favorite pop-up museum, mostly because I get to dress up as a Jedi at these, but also because it's a wonderful way to talk about paleontology and geology using the world of Star Wars. And here we have one of our science educators and collections assistants at the museum, Bailey, teaching Rey Skywalker, I guess now. It sounds weird still saying it. About Smilodons, which was a stand-in for a tusk cat from Naboo. I could go on and on about the different animals of Star Wars, but I'm actually running low on my time, so I'm gonna move on from there. But yeah, that's, again, what I do. When I do cosplay for science or anything now at the museum, my whole thing is about getting people to appreciate the scientific world around them, right? Whether we are talking about Star Wars or climate change or dinosaurs or, you know, even how like your phone works or anything like that. My whole goal is to get folks to learn how to think critically in fictional worlds or really easy settings, and hope that they can take those skills that they build practicing and apply them to the real world in times when it matters, whether it's for voting, right? Asking questions about things that they hear, questioning information that they hear on the news, even from professional sources. The goal is to get them to learn to come to their own conclusions the right way by critical thinking and, again, storytelling. That comes down to one of my favorite quotes, again, when I got to say this when I was doing a TED Talk for about cosplay for science dressed as a Jedi, which I never thought I was going to be able to do, but it was a really cool experience. But in the end, it's about understanding is honoring the truth beneath the surface. And that's a quote from Star Wars: The Clone Wars, season 4, episode 5. It's a great episode if you want to check it out. So thank you all so much for bearing with my nerdiness. I just want to say thanks to the Alf Museum for letting me find my true calling in the world. And if you want to learn more about the work that I do with Cosplay for Science, you can find us online at cosplayforscience.com. And if you have Instagram, you can follow me there. So thank you very much.
Excellent talk as always, Gabe. That was awesome. I still just need more proof that you love Star Wars. There's just not enough there.
I mean, I'm in the Rebel base on Yavin right now.
I see that. So we do have a few questions. If you'd like to address them now, we have time.
Oh, wait. Yeah, I'm happy to go over questions.
So Sam Barkey asks, how many different kinds of Desmostylians were there?
That's a great question, Sam. So Desmostylians, we have 3 different groups of Desmostylians, okay? So the oldest group are the Behematopsids. They were the very first groups of Desmostylians to appear about 30 million years ago. And they still look very similar to hippos, but they're a little bit smaller than the end Desmostylians. And from the Behematopsids, you branch into 2 other groups. You have the Desmostylians or Desmostylids, which are the groups I worked on, and you have the Paleoparadoxids, another group of Desmostylians. And they differ kind of in their skull shape and their teeth shape, but those are the 3 main groups of Desmostylians. Now, when we talk about species, there is about 15, I believe. There might be more, but I think it's 15 because in my paper, I actually got to sync one of the genera of Desmostylians and combine it with Desmostylus. So I made less Desmostylian groups.
All right. Another question we have is, in the TALEGA bone bed, were the other animals that were there other animals that were not Desmostylians?
Actually, yeah. So I'm sorry if I was confusing everybody. Desmostylians were not found in Talega bonebed. The Talega bonebed is 45 million years old, and Desmostylians didn't appear until 30 million years. And the one I studied is about 12 million years old. So there's no Desmostylians in the Talega bonebed. But in the bonebed, like I said, we had 24 different groups of animals and lots of really cool ones. So some of my favorite ones in there is we had crocodilians. Lots and lots of croc teeth were found in the bonebed. Some of them we hypothesized were from a crocodilian that actually was not very aquatic. It was more adapted to hunting prey on land. So imagine you're walking around and there's a crocodilian that will chase you down. So I'm pretty glad those are extinct. We had giant boas about this big around. We had rhinos, tiny little rhinos. We had horses that were about this big. We had these weird animals called brontotheres. Most people who've been through the Alf Museum know what a brontothere is. They're those huge rhino-like relatives with the big crest, bony crest in front of their nose. But the ones we had in California actually didn't have those. They had tiny little bumps instead. We had tiny things called protorodons. We had tiny camels. We had lots of weird early meat eaters, relatives of dogs and cats that look nothing like them. And we also had lots of tiny rodents. I spent hours picking through Matrix trying to find tiny rodents. So if anybody's here has done Fossil Matrix and I made you do it, know that I felt sorry while I was having you do it. But yeah, oh, we also had a really cool early primate called Dicoelomys pacificus. It's the only primate that was found in that area at the time. And it's probably about that big, and it's super, super cute. So those were some of the animals we had in the Talega bonebed.
All right, and Sylvia asked, I thought augmented reality was new. When did you use this? And that I think that was when you were going through the Mongolia trip.
Yeah, so augmented reality, the technology itself has been around for like quite a few years now, but not in the level of accessibility that it is now. Anyone who has a smartphone now has access to augmented reality in an instant. And so I used it when I was in Mongolia. Actually, I first used it at the Alf Museum. So some of our exhibits at the Alf Museum can use our augmented reality app to translate, well, not translate, it overlays Spanish language versions of our exhibits over the real ones on your phone. And so I use that same method in Mongolia to take the Mongolian Cyrillic versions of exhibits and overlay them on the English version of the exhibits. And so that's kind of what I got to go to Mongolia for, was for that part of the project.
Okay. Danielle asked, how big is a tiny camel?
Okay. So tiny camel is about the size of, if anyone's seen a dik-dik, that's like the closest living animal I can think of. But maybe if you think of like something the size of a Jack Russell Terrier, maybe, that's how big some of these camels were. So imagine like, yeah, a camel that's this big, full grown, like walking around the ancient rainforests of California. Super cute. I probably would have had one if it was okay, if we were still around at that time. So yeah, that's how big a tiny camel was.
So Diana asked, well, she claps and says, very nice, Gabe. What was your favorite part about working in Mongolia?
Oh, that's a question. My favorite part actually was getting to interact with a lot of students, because I went to Mongolia not knowing Mongolian, right? So I only knew like very little introductory words, and then having to try to be a teacher to students who have no English skills either. It was a very interesting challenge. But while I was there, you know, I learned some words and enough that I was able to kind of communicate information. And so that was a really interesting way for me to learn more about how accessibility and universal design, as some of us call it, where you can teach something or have something created and designed that it's universally accessible no matter what your abilities are, whether it's language or disabilities. That was a really great experiment in that. And one of the ways I did it was we had a bunch of plastic dinosaurs on the bus, and I learned how to pronounce the dinosaurs' names in Mongolian a little bit. And I also learned how to say yes, no, correct, or wrong. And so the teacher that was with me who spoke Mongolian, I'd raise it up and she'd say like, Dinzar, which means dinosaur, yes or no. And then I would, bring it and they'd say yes or no. And then I'd be like, bish or mong, which means correct or incorrect. And so I was getting to ask these kids and think about what makes a dinosaur, even though we weren't able to speak in the same language. So that was probably my favorite part. Also the food.
Paige also asked, great presentation, Gabe. Any idea what the Desmostylians teeth have? What, I'm trying to get the last part here, but look like multiple circular shaped depression.
Yeah, I think I get it. It's a question I get a lot. So Desmostylians, like I said, their teeth are like a bunch of sushi rolls all grouped together, right? And so those aren't individual teeth. Those are one tooth, and each one of those is kind of like the cusps on our teeth. And so those depressions that are in there with the really, really thick enamel, that black part that I guess is equivalent to the seaweed on a sushi roll, that is very, very thick. It's one of the hardest substances in nature. And so when they are able chewing on grasses and getting the sand in their mouth, that very thick enamel and those thick teeth and the arrangement allow them to create this really cool, unique grinding surface that help them to be somewhat as efficient as they could be in eating seagrasses while also dealing with the very silicious environment.
Cool. Okay, so we have two more questions. The first one is from Sylvia, and she says, were the real meats, the digital has to be a boon for paleontologists?
Yeah, so yeah, we're real meets digital. That is one of the coolest things about being a paleontologist and educator for me nowadays. It's just the access to technology. Whenever we go to a comic book convention or something, or a community event, even the youngest kids have smart devices, and that allows us to create new levels of engagement. And with social media, that allows us, or even just technology, it allows us to reach audiences we have never thought about reaching before. Like I said, with Mongolia, I was able to communicate science thanks to a smart device. Billy, all of our other educators at the museum, Monique and Chelsea, we've been able to do international virtual experiences from our house of the museum to folks around the world thanks to technology. It's something that I'm always appreciative of, and also very wary at the same time, because it takes a lot to learn the ins and outs of technology. I'm still learning a lot about the best practices for some of them, but it really has changed the way that we interact with our audiences globally. And it's something that I'm very grateful for as an educator myself.
All right, and last question from Carol. Is there evidence of Desmostylians in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so Desmostylians are really cool because they lived all along the North Pacific coast. So their range starts in Baja, Mexico. You go up through California to Washington, Canada, Alaska, Russia. Sakhalin Island has a lot, great ones, down through Korea, China, and Japan. So they're found all along that coast, but they're not found anywhere else in the world. They're not found below the equator because in South America, they had aquatic sloths that were in the same ecological niche as Desmostylians. So they never reached down that way. And on the other side of the Pacific, there wasn't really much. It was tropical and not many, there were a lot of dugongs and Serenians living at that time. So they never got past Japan, but that's where you can find Desmostylians today. One of my favorite things to say is that Desmostylians are very big in Japan. They're kind of as popular as T-Rex in Japan. And when I got to go there with Dinosaur Joe, I was really excited because they had a whole exhibit dedicated to Desmostylians. All these kids were there and they're just like, oh, this is cool. And I'm like standing around like running from exhibit to exhibit. Like, I love this so much. I want to take a picture with every Desmostylian. There was like a little game that they had where you can make a Desmostylian. And I probably hogged it from a bunch of kids for like 30 minutes because we don't get Desmostylians here. There's only 4 researchers here in the United States that really study Desmostylians. I don't really include myself in it anymore because I don't do much research. But we don't get much with Desmostylians. It's a funny story, actually. All of the Desmostylian researchers at one time went on a trip to Mexico, and I was really sad because I really wanted to go. And I asked one of them, like, can I go, please? I want to learn about Desmostylians from all of you. And he looks at me and grabs my shoulder and is like, Gabe, you can't go. If something happens to us, you are all that's left. And so I was like, okay, fine. I guess I won't go.
All right. So thank you all so much for joining us today on Moments of Time.